The proposition comes before us today with a dangerously idealistic vision. Pack more students into universities using debt, force them into state-mandated bonds, and miraculously cure Indonesia's economic woes. But their model is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Indonesian economic landscape and a predatory view of the higher education. Honorable Speaker and esteemed government, as the leader of the opposition, I will prove today that introducing a student loan mechanism, even under the guise of the Singaporean model, is a catastrophic mistake for Indonesia. My two main arguments will consist of one, why comparing Indonesia to Singapore is a false equivalence that ignores our massive informal economy, and second, why state-mandated bonds and debt act as an economic chokehold rather than an incentive for development. My second speaker will further analyze the psychological and social burden of debt that Indonesian lower middle class may experience. And before moving on to my substantive arguments, let us address the flawed premises brought forward by the Prime Minister. The government proudly champions that Singaporean model is better because you only pay it back once you get a job. They want you to believe that this is a risk-free safety net. But however, if you look at reality, Singapore is not Indonesia. Singapore has a highly formalized, tightly regulated, and high-paying job market with a negligible unemployment rate. While, on the other hand, Indonesia's job market is entirely different. We are currently facing a severe shortage of formal high-skilled jobs for university graduates, leading to a massive underemployment where engineering graduates end up working as Uber drivers just to survive. What happens to Indonesia's government model then? If a graduate takes a low-paying informal job, do they trigger the repayment threshold? And if they do you plunge a struggling young professional into immediate poverty? If they don't, then on the other hand, will the government just continue to accrue massive bad debt, causing the exact fiscal collapse we see in Western models either way? You then say current scholarships are unfair because wealthy students have the resources to be smart enough to win them. Therefore, they say give the rest loans. Now, this logic is completely backwards. The government recognizes a structural inequality in our primary and secondary education systems, and their solution is to instead saddle the unprivileged with a lifetime of debt, while the wealthy continue to enjoy free rides. That is not equity, that is state-sanctioned exploitation. If the state has the financial capital to back, insure, and administer a massive national student loan infrastructure, that same capital should be instead redirected into expanding targeted, need-based scholarship quotas like KIP Kuliah and upgrading regional public universities. You do not fix a broken ladder by charging the poorest people a toll to climb it. Finally, the government wants to implement mandatory work bonds so students don't escape Indonesia. They want to chain our brightest minds to the country by force, essentially. Honorable Speaker, economic retention is not achieved through coercion. If you force a brilliant data scientist or biotechnology graduate to stay in Indonesia under a low-paying bond, when our domestic industries aren't advanced enough to utilize them, you don't create economic value. Instead, you'll be creating a resentful, demotivated, and underemployed workforce. This instead can be solved by fixing the domestic economy and creating competitive industries, not by turning the nation into a debtor's prison. Furthermore, for the Singaporean model to work, you need absolute institutional transparency. That is what Indonesia does not have. It's this infrastructure. We're a nation with a massive unbanked population, widespread cash transactions, and an enormous informal economy. When the government introduces a loan system dependent on tracking income, they are inviting an administrative nightmare. Fresh graduates who enter the formal corporate sector will be automatically taxed and heavily burdened by repayments. Meanwhile, graduates who choose to start unregistered businesses will easily evade tracking. This creates a deeply unfair system that punishes formal employment. And on the other hand, for those who cannot pay, the defaults will register on the financial system. And then, in turn, at 23 or 24 years old, a generation of Indonesian youth will find themselves blacklisted from the formal banking sector. This means that they won't be able to get a housing loan or a vehicle loan or microcredit to start a small business. Instead of mobilizing the workforce, you're financially paralyzing them before their careers even begin. My second substantive argument dives into the argument addressing the long-term macroeconomic damage of forcing students into mandatory domestic work bonds. So what exactly does that mean? Well, the government views that talent is through a highly protectionist lens. They fear that if a student goes abroad, Indonesia loses. And this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how developing economies grow in a globalized world. When Indonesian youth go abroad to work in global tech hubs like Silicon Valley, Tokyo, or Singapore, they're not escaping. They're acquiring cutting-edge skills or building international networks and thereby also accumulating global capital. They're learning from the rest of the world. They're learning from different teachers, different backgrounds, and different environments. Historically, this is how developing nations leapfrog. Look at how the founders of Indonesia's biggest technologies and startup giants were educated and worked abroad before returning to Indonesia to build platforms that employ hundreds of thousands of Indonesians. By enforcing strict debt-driven bonds, the government cuts off this pipeline of global knowledge that was transferred to these students. You're going to instead trap Indonesian talent within a domestic economy that may not yet have the infrastructure to absorb their highly specialized skill. And then you also restrict their earning potential, meaning that they take longer to pay back the economy in taxes and consumption. And then you also stifle the organic entrepreneurship that happens when young people have the freedom to take risks, relocate, and innovate during their youth. Forcing a graduate into a state-selected bond just to recoup a loan is short-sighted fiscal desperation that sacrifices long-term national innovation for short-term debt collection. Honorable Speaker, the government's model is an ideological surrender. They offer our youth a predatory bargain. They take debt you cannot reliably pay based on a job market that cannot guarantee your employment and hand over your freedom via a state bond. We on the opposition side refuse this bargain. We stand for an Indonesia that empowers its youth through expanded, equitable, and robust vocational pathways and a free dynamic job market that attracts talent rather than chaining it down to a single nation. The government's case is structurally unfeasible, economically damaging, and socially unjust. The motion must fall. Thank you for listening.